Jin-Ho had built his empire on three unbreakable rules: never show mercy, never trust outsiders, and never, ever let someone who didn't understand his world anywhere near his throne. Black women especially were a category he'd learned to dismiss before they even spoke, a prejudice passed down like heirloom silver, polished by his father's sneers and his grandfather's silences. But when the Council of Elders gave him 1 year to produce a wife or lose everything he'd bled for, he walked into that restaurant expecting a transaction. Instead, he found Tessa Harper, a woman with midnight skin and a gaze that didn't flinch when he tried to freeze her out. She didn't beg for his approval. She didn't perform for his comfort. And when gunfire shattered the crystal stemware and rival syndicate soldiers stormed through the doors, she didn't scream. She moved like someone who understood that survival wasn't about noise. It was about precision. That's when Jin-Ho realized his greatest threat wasn't the bullet with his name on it. It was the woman who made him want to be something other than a monster. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what you are doing as you enjoy the story. I want to know. And tell me, do you think Jin-Ho deserves a chance, or should Tessa make him work for it? Let's get into the next part of their story. Seoul's Gangnam District, 6:47 p.m. Friday. The thing about controlling a multi-billion-dollar criminal empire was that people rarely questioned Baek Jin-Ho's decisions. Politicians stammered apologies before he finished speaking. Business rivals vanished into construction site accidents. Even his enemies showed respect, mostly because disrespect had a nasty habit of ending with bodies wrapped in plastic and dumped in Incheon's industrial ports. So when the Council of Elders, 5 ancient men who smelled like medicinal herbs and old violence, summoned him to the private room of a Bukchon tea house and delivered their ultimatum, Jin-Ho experienced something he hadn't felt in over a decade: genuine visceral rage. 1 year, Elder Choi had said, his wrinkled hands steady around a porcelain cup. Produce a suitable wife, or we transfer operational control to your cousin Daejung. Jin-Ho's jaw had tightened so hard he thought his molars might crack. Daejung sold luxury car imports and couldn't negotiate his way out of a parking ticket without crying to his mother. You want me to marry for optics? Jin-Ho had said flatly. We want you to marry for legacy. Elder Choi's eyes were black stones. Your grandfather understood this. Your father failed to teach you. We will not watch this family die with you simply because you're too proud to touch a woman who isn't a business transaction. Now, 73 hours later, Jin-Ho sat in the back of his armored Maybach, adjusting platinum cufflinks that cost more than most people's mortgages, and contemplated the various ways he could make Elder Choi suffer without technically violating the blood oath that kept the council untouchable. We've arrived, sir, his driver said quietly. Through the tinted windows, Jin-Ho could see Myeongdong's private dining district, the kind of restaurant that didn't have signs, only whispered reservations and a waiting list measured in years. His grandmother had arranged everything, which meant this blind date was either a genuine attempt to save his soul or an elaborate psychological warfare operation. With Grandmother Beck, it was always both. He stepped out into the rain-slick street, his Tom Ford suit absorbing the mist like expensive armor. The restaurant's entrance was unmarked except for a single brass number. Inside, soft light and softer music. The kind of place where people conducted business that couldn't be recorded. A hostess bowed so low her forehead nearly touched her knees. Mr. Beck, your guest has already arrived. The private room on the 3rd floor? Already here. Either punctual or desperate. Jin-Ho wasn't sure which was worse. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step a meditation in control. He would be polite, civil. He would endure 2 hours of whatever social climbing woman his grandmother had dug up, then return to his penthouse and burn this evening from his memory with 20-year-old whiskey and silence. The server slid open the shoji screen, and Jin-Ho's entire world stuttered to a halt. She sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, wearing a dress the color of deep wine that somehow made her brown skin look like it had been dipped in gold. Natural hair pulled back in a way that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. No desperate smile, no performative nervousness, just presence. Tessa Harper looked up at him with eyes that were calm, assessing, and utterly unimpressed. Mr. Baek, she said in perfect, unaccented Korean, your grandmother said you'd be exactly 7 minutes late. I believe you're only at 6.5. Should I be concerned that you're becoming unpredictable? Jin-Ho stood frozen in the doorway, every prejudice he'd ever inherited screaming at him to turn around. Every instinct he'd honed telling him this woman was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with weapons. Because when he looked at her, he didn't see an outsider. He saw someone who might actually see him. And that was more terrifying than any rival syndicate could ever be. Tessa Harper had learned 3 essential truths about cooking for Seoul's elite before she ever set foot in Baek Jin-Ho's world. First, presentation mattered more than taste, at least to the clients who paid her retainer. They wanted Instagram-worthy plates and stories they could tell at cocktail parties about their innovative American chef. She gave them both, then went home and made herself scrambled eggs that actually had flavor. Second, being a black woman in South Korea meant existing in a permanent state of hypervisibility and invisibility simultaneously. People stared. People touched her hair without asking. People spoke about her in Korean while standing 3 feet away, assuming she couldn't understand every syllable. She'd stopped correcting them after the first year. Let them underestimate her. It made negotiations easier when they thought she was decorative rather than deliberate. Third, and most important, never let them see you flinch. She'd built her reputation one private dinner at a time, catering for chaebol families who wanted the prestige of an internationally trained chef without the mess of actually respecting her. Culinary Institute of America graduate, 3 years apprenticing under a Michelin-starred chef in New York, consulting work that took her from London to Tokyo to finally, inexplicably, Seoul. Her mother had been horrified. You're going where, baby? You know how they are about. I know, Mama. Tessa had packed her knives with the same careful precision she used for everything else. But the contract is good, and I'm tired of waiting for spaces that were never built for me anyway. Seoul hadn't welcomed her, but it had needed her, which was different and somehow enough. Now, sitting in a private dining room that probably cost more per hour than her monthly rent, waiting for a blind date she'd agreed to, only because Mrs. Baek had been so persistently, devastatingly kind, Tessa reminded herself of those 3 truths. Presentation, hypervisibility, never flinch. She'd done her research, of course. Googled Baek Jin-Ho and found exactly what she expected: a wall of corporate press releases, real estate development announcements, and precisely 0 personal information. The photos showed a man who looked like he'd been carved from marble and disappointment, handsome in that severe, untouchable way that made her think of museum sculptures roped off behind velvet barriers. Mrs. Baek had promised he was a good boy, just lonely. Tessa had smiled and nodded and privately translated that as emotionally unavailable and possibly insufferable. She checked her phone. 6:53 p.m. 7 minutes until he was supposed to arrive, which meant he'd probably walk in at exactly 7:07. Late enough to establish dominance, but not so late it registered as disrespect. Men like him, men who controlled things, always needed the entrance to mean something. The door slid open at 6:56. Tessa looked up and felt something shift in the room's air pressure. He was taller than the photos suggested, broader in the shoulders, with a face that managed to be both beautiful and threatening. The suit was perfect. The expression was permafrost, and his eyes, dark, assessing, already dismissing her, held exactly the look she'd been expecting. The look that said, "You don't belong here." Tessa Harper had spent 27 years proving people wrong about what she deserved. She smiled, not warmly, and spoke in the Korean that had taken her 3 years of night classes and stubborn persistence to master. Mr. Baek, your grandmother said you'd be exactly 7 minutes late. I believe you're only at 6.5. Should I be concerned that you're becoming unpredictable? She watched his face for the crack. It didn't come, but something flickered behind those cold eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the first whisper of something that might eventually become respect. Good, she thought. Let's see what you're actually made of. Hit that subscribe button and like the video already. It gladdens my heart after a strenuous process of this story production. I want to know. And tell me, do you think Jin-Ho deserves a chance? or should Tessa make him work for it? Let's get into the next part of their story. Jin-Ho had perfected the art of the power move over 15 years of negotiations, territorial disputes, and business dealings, where a single wrong gesture could end with bodies in the Han River. He knew exactly how long to hold eye contact before it became aggression, knew the precise angle to tilt his head to communicate boredom, knew that silence, deployed correctly, could make grown men confess to crimes they hadn't even committed yet. None of it worked on Tessa Harper. He sat down across from her with the deliberate slowness of a man who owned every room he entered, letting the silence stretch like a blade between them. She should look away, should fidget, should fill the void with nervous chatter the way every other woman his grandmother had paraded in front of him had done. Instead, Tessa reached for her water glass with steady hands and took a sip, her gaze never leaving his face. The silence expanded. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Jin-Ho felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Not fear, he'd forgotten how to feel that, but something adjacent to it. Uncertainty, maybe. The distinct sensation of a strategy failing in real time. "Your grandmother speaks very highly of you," Tessa said finally, setting down her glass with a soft click against the table. Her Korean was flawless, which shouldn't have surprised him, but somehow did. "She says you're brilliant, disciplined, and chronically incapable of enjoying anything that doesn't come with a profit margin. My grandmother," Jin-Ho said carefully, "has always had an overactive imagination. She also said you'd try to intimidate me with silence." Tessa's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "How am I doing so far?" Jin-Ho felt his jaw tighten. Every instinct he'd honed told him to shut this down, to freeze her out until she understood exactly where she stood in his hierarchy of importance, which was nowhere. She was nobody, an American, an outsider. He stopped himself before the thought could fully form, aware that even thinking it made him exactly what his grandmother had accused him of being during their last argument. His father's son in all the worst ways. "You're direct," he said instead. "I found that people appreciate knowing where they stand." Tessa folded her hands on the table, her posture perfect without being rigid. "So let me be clear, Mr. Baek. I didn't ask for this date. Your grandmother ambushed me after I catered her book club meeting, and she's terrifying in a way that makes saying no feel like a personal failure. I'm here out of respect for her, not because I need a husband or a business connection or whatever it is you think women show up to blind dates looking for." Jin-Ho stared at her. In his world, people didn't speak to him like this. They bowed and scraped and measured every word for maximum deference. "Then why are you here?" he asked, genuinely curious for the first time in years. Tessa met his gaze with those impossibly steady eyes. "Because Mrs. Baek loves you enough to be worried. And I thought maybe, just maybe, there might be something worth worrying about underneath all that ice." The statement hung between them like a challenge. Jin-Ho realized, with something close to horror, that he wanted to prove her right. Jin-Ho ordered without consulting her, a power move so predictable, Tessa almost laughed. When the food arrived, arranged like art installations on minimalist plates, she studied each dish with the clinical precision of someone who understood that presentation without substance was just expensive lying. She picked up her chopsticks, tasted the braised short rib, and set them down with a softness that somehow felt louder than slamming them on the table. "This is what you eat?" she asked in Korean. His eyes narrowed. "It's from one of Seoul's finest. It's sterile." She gestured at the perfectly geometric vegetables, the sauce applied with mathematical precision. "Beautiful, expensive, completely soulless. This food doesn't want to feed you. It wants to impress you." Jin-Ho's jaw tightened. No one critiqued his choices. Not business partners, not rivals, certainly not a woman he'd met 17 minutes ago. "And what would you suggest?" The question came out colder than he intended. Tessa met his gaze without flinching. "Food that tastes like someone actually cares if you live or die." Something cracked in his chest. Small, hairline, dangerous. "My grandmother used to make kimchi jjigae," he said quietly, surprising himself. "She'd burn her fingers pulling the pot off the stove because she refused to wait. Said food that sat too long lost its heat, and heat was the whole point." Protection, Tessa said softly. That's what heat is. She was protecting you the only way she knew how. Jin-Ho stared at this woman who somehow understood what he'd spent years trying to forget, that beneath every meal his grandmother forced on him was the desperate love of someone who'd already buried too many people. You think food is protection? His voice was barely above a whisper. Tessa's smile was sad and knowing. I think we protect people however we can. Your grandmother uses soup. I use perfectly seasoned truth. She paused. What do you use, Mr. Baek? Guns, he thought. Money, fear. Walls so high no one can see me bleed. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he picked up his chopsticks and tasted the food again, really tasted it this time, and realized she was absolutely right. It was beautiful, and it was completely, devastatingly empty, just like him. The dinner had been going too well, which should have been Jin-Ho's first warning. They'd made it through appetizers, delicate lotus root chips that Tessa had critiqued with the precision of someone who actually understood food beyond its price tag. They'd survived the main course, a Wagyu preparation that Jin-Ho had watched her dissect with her eyes before her fork, noting techniques and temperatures like she was reading a language he'd never learned. He'd almost forgotten to maintain his walls. That's when he made the mistake. The server brought dessert, some avant-garde thing involving black sesame and gold leaf, and Tessa laughed, actually laughed, at the pretension of it. The sound was warm and unguarded, and it did something dangerous to Jin-Ho's chest. Your grandmother told me you hate sweet things, she said, pushing the plate toward him anyway. But I'm guessing you hate performances more. He should have left it alone, should have smiled politely and changed the subject. Instead, something ugly and inherited crawled up his throat. My grandmother has optimistic ideas about compatibility. His voice was carefully neutral, which made it worse. She thinks exposure fixes fundamental differences, that I can overlook certain cultural gaps. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Tessa set down her fork with the same careful precision she'd used all evening. When she looked at him, her eyes weren't angry. They were something worse, disappointed. Cultural gaps. She repeated the words like she was tasting poison. Is that what we're calling it now? I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Her voice was soft, devastating. You meant exactly what you said, that I'm a novelty, an experiment your grandmother arranged, something you're trying to overlook like I'm a flaw in an otherwise acceptable transaction. Jin-Ho's throat closed. Here's what's interesting, Mr. Baek. Tessa stood, gathering her purse with movements that were perfectly controlled. I knew you were a criminal before I walked in here. Your grandmother warned me. I came anyway because I thought maybe underneath all that ice there was something worth finding. She met his eyes one last time. Turns out I was wrong about the cultural gap. It's not between Korea and America. It's between people who see other people as human and people like you. The door closed behind her with a whisper. Jin-Ho sat alone with gold leaf dessert he couldn't taste, and the first genuine shame he'd felt in 15 years. The first gunshot shattered the window before it shattered the illusion. Jin-Ho moved before the glass finished falling, his hand clamping around Tessa's wrist as he yanked her beneath the table with a force that should have hurt but somehow didn't. His other hand had already pulled a gun from somewhere inside that perfect suit, a weapon that looked like it had been waiting there all along, patient and deadly. Stay down, he said, and his voice had changed completely. No more careful politeness. No more measured distance. This was command, cold and absolute. 3 more shots punched through the shoji screens. Tessa heard shouting in Korean, sharp, aggressive voices that didn't belong to restaurant staff. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her breathing steady, controlled, the way she did when a souffle was collapsing, and there was no time for panic. Jin-Ho rose slightly, fired twice without hesitation. Someone screamed, someone fell. How many? A voice crackled through what Tessa now realized was an earpiece he'd been wearing the entire dinner. 4 in the hallway, possibly more outside. Jin-Ho's eyes scanned the room with clinical precision, calculating angles and exits like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Because he had. Secure the lower floors. I'm extracting through the kitchen. Extracting. Like this was a military operation. Like violence was just another language he spoke fluently. He looked down at Tessa, still crouched beneath the table in her wine-colored dress, and something almost like regret crossed his face. "I'm sorry you had to see this," he said quietly. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression went from regret to something far more dangerous. "They know who you are," he said. "They know you're with me, which means you're not safe anywhere in this city except—" He stopped himself, jaw clenching. "We need to leave. Now." Tessa looked at the gun in his hand. The body's in the hallway. The man she'd been having dinner with, who was clearly, undeniably, something far worse than a real estate developer. "What exactly," she said, voice steady despite everything, "do you do for a living, Mr. Beck?" His smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "I'll explain in the car. If we survive the next 5 minutes." Subscribe and like if they survived. Jin-Ho's penthouse was exactly what Tessa expected. Glass, steel, and the kind of silence that felt expensive. What she didn't expect was the blood seeping through his white shirt, dark and spreading like spilled ink. "You're hurt," she said flatly. "It's nothing." He moved toward the bathroom, each step measured, controlled, still playing the untouchable king even while bleeding. Tessa followed him anyway. "Sit down before you pass out and ruin your marble floor." He turned, surprise flickering across his face before the mask slammed back down. But he sat, on the edge of his obscenely large bathtub, under lights that made his skin look pale, almost vulnerable. She found the first aid kit. Of course he had a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in a surgical theater, and knelt in front of him. His hands moved to unbutton his shirt, but they trembled slightly. "Let me," Tessa said quietly. Jin-Ho froze. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, that his pride would force him to bleed out rather than accept help. Then his hands dropped. She worked in silence, peeling back fabric sticky with blood. The wound wasn't deep, a graze across his ribs, angry and red, but not life-threatening. She cleaned it with steady hands, the same precision she used for deboning fish. "You're not afraid," he said finally. Not a question, an accusation. Tessa met his eyes. "Of you? No. You should be." "Why?" She pressed gauze against his skin, watching him flinch. "Because you're dangerous? Because you hurt people." She taped the bandage carefully. "I've seen dangerous men before, Mr. Beck. They don't bleed alone in empty penthouses, pretending they don't need anyone." Something cracked in his expression. Just for a second, just enough. "You pity me," he said, voice hard. "I do," Tessa admitted. She stood, gathering bloodied gauze. "And I think that terrifies you more than any bullet ever could." She left him sitting there, surrounded by luxury and loneliness, realizing she'd seen straight through to the wound no bandage could ever cover. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of Gangnam's most exclusive tower, the one that didn't advertise, didn't take applications, and had exactly 7 residents, all of whom could buy small countries without checking their account balances. Jin-Ho's private elevator required both a key card and a fingerprint scan. Tessa noticed he positioned himself between her and the door, a protective instinct he probably didn't even realize he had anymore. "Your grandmother's going to call me in approximately 4 hours, Tessa said as the elevator climbed silently. "She'll want to know if you were a gentleman." "What will you tell her?" His voice was rough, still carrying the edge of adrenaline from the restaurant siege. "Depends on what happens in the next 4 hours." The elevator opened directly into his apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering sprawl. Furniture that looked like it had been selected by an architect with a vendetta against warmth. Everything black, white, chrome, sterile as an operating room. "You live here?" Tessa walked to the windows, her wine-colored dress the only spot of color in the entire space. "It looks like a very expensive waiting room." Jin-Ho moved to the bar, poured 2 glasses of something that probably cost more than her monthly salary. "I don't entertain." "I can tell." He crossed to a wall panel, pressed something, and a hidden drawer slid open. Inside were files, thick manila folders with official seals. He pulled them out, carried them to the fireplace that had probably never been used. "What are those?" "Arranged marriage candidates." Jin-Ho dropped them into the gas fireplace. turned the switch. Flames consumed the folders instantly. The council presented me with 15 options, all acceptable bloodlines, all appropriate backgrounds. Tessa watched the files burn, understanding exactly what this gesture meant. And now, Jin-Ho turned to face her. And for the first time since they'd met, his expression was completely unguarded, dangerous, devoted. Now there's only you. The files turned to ash. Outside, Seoul glittered like a city made of broken promises, and inside something infinitely more fragile began. Jin-Ho stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching Seoul's lights blur through the rain. Behind him, Tessa slept in his bed. His bed, where no one had ever been allowed, wrapped in sheets that cost more than most people's cars, but somehow looked better on her than they ever had empty. 3 weeks ago, he would have killed a man for suggesting this moment was possible. Now he'd kill a man for looking at her wrong. The shift had been seismic, inevitable. Somewhere between the gunfire and her steady hands dressing his wounds, between her quiet refusal to fear him and the way she'd looked at his tattoos like they were art instead of evidence, Jin-Ho had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd burned the arranged marriage files, sent a message to the council that was polite in wording but absolute in meaning. There will be no other candidates. Elder Choi had called it reckless attachment to an unsuitable woman. Jin-Ho had called it non-negotiable and hung up. His phone buzzed. A report from his security team. 3 low-level associates from a rival faction had been asking questions about the black woman the boss brought home. Their tone had been dismissive, mocking. Jin-Ho's jaw tightened as he typed a single response. Handle it. Make it memorable. He used to look at Tessa the way they did, like she was something foreign, something lesser, something that didn't belong in his pristine world. The shame of it burned hotter than any bullet wound. She'd shattered every prejudice he'd inherited, not by fighting him, but by simply refusing to shrink, by being exactly who she was while he crumbled into something new. Behind him, he heard her shift in the sheets. Jin-Ho? Her voice was sleep-soft. Come back to bed. He turned from the window, from the city he controlled, from the empire built on blood and ice, and went to her. Because the most dangerous thing Baek Jin-Ho had ever done wasn't building a criminal dynasty. It was falling in love with the woman who made him want to burn it all down and build something better. For her, only for her,